All right, can everyone hear me okay? All right, fantastic, awesome. Thanks so much for joining me today. I hope you guys have all enjoyed Inforce so far, and I know we're getting towards the tail end of that. Yeah, please hit your headphones. Yeah, cool, awesome. So I want to introduce myself first. So my name is Stefan Buckman, and I'm an enterprise solution architect from Melbourne, Australia. So a long way away. However, I used to live in Boston, so this is a bit of a homecoming for me, so it's awesome to be here today. So I wanted to take a slightly different approach in the conversation today, and we're going to be talking about a challenge a lot of organizations face in terms of AI and identity management, and specifically the challenges around identity management. And instead of focusing on one service or one technology too deeply, what I wanted to do was I wanted to explore the art of the possible and look at where we can take artificial intelligence as well as our services, and we'll explore our security services, and use those in the context of really addressing identity management challenges within organizations. And that's really what we're going to do today. So part of what we're going to do is we're going to explore the problem from the customer and understand from customers what are some of the challenges around identity management. From there, I've got a bit of a demo to run through to show you the architecture as well as the application we've created to really showcase some of the services as well as what you can accomplish for really an economy of scale in terms of how much it would actually cost to run. And then we'll take a deeper dive into some of the technology and understand the technology that underpins it and allows that service to function. So what we generally do is start backwards from the problem. And we want to start backwards from understanding where customers face challenges with identity management. So if we explore those challenges that customers face, the first thing that we start off with is, generally speaking, for a customer that uses, say, a self-service or a service desk, I should say, password changes or any call to that service desk is generally around $40 US per call to that service desk. Now that can fluctuate a little bit lower and a little bit higher, but the data generally tells us it's about $40. So that means any call to the service desk, you're really paying that price. From the data, we also know that about 20 to 50% of calls to the service desk are generally for simple identity management challenges, things like account unlocks, password resets, or potentially joining or leaving groups within an organization. So if we take those factors in that data and we take an average organization size of, let's say, 5,000 people and put all of that together, we end up with upwards of about a $2 million problem for an organization. That means organizations are generally spending upwards of that fee just to handle really some simple tasks that we can think can be better handled using other mechanisms. And I'm not going to dwell on dwell time, pardon the pun, too much, but I wanted to just talk about as organizations potentially change how they handle passwords, and passwords is a big subject right now, potentially getting rid of those password resets, potentially lengthening time between passwords or reducing the complexity in passwords. Ultimately, that can potentially change the security hygiene of an organization. And in some cases, that's measured by dwell time, or the time an attacker may sit on the network before you recognize you have an attacker on the network. And while not directly correlated, we want to make sure that customers, yourselves, have a really good posture when it comes to security and a really good security hygiene. So that's really the problem that we wanted to explore. So when we focus on why organizations struggle, there are a couple of reasons they struggle, and there are four that I'm going to talk about right now. Specifically, the first aspect for why customers struggle is it's expensive. We've already discussed how it's upwards of a $2 million problem for an organization, but we're going to delve into that a little bit more to understand why those challenges are there and how we can actually address those challenges. But it is an expensive problem. In addition, it's manual, especially if you're using a service desk. Someone has to call the service desk, they have to identify themselves, and that service desk agent really has to change the password for them and correctly communicate that back. So there's a large degree or a large potential for errors in that process where you'd have to potentially call the service desk back again. In addition to that, it's insecure. I don't know about your organizations, but generally speaking, for many organizations, if I know the number of that service desk and I know just a little bit of information about that employee, there's a good degree that I can actually call the service desk and potentially have their password changed on my behalf. And that's something that we'd really like to see addressed, because that's a really interesting and easy attack vector for an organization. And finally, we understand it's complicated. That means that if you're using a service desk, or if you're potentially buying a SaaS solution or an over-the-shelf IDM software solution, we know that those are complicated packages to potentially deploy and potentially require consulting or bespoke engineering experience to actually implement those solutions for customers. So security, as you heard at the keynote, is always our top priority at AWS. So what I wanted to do is, number one, I want to just segue for a second and focus on how we approach security at AWS. Look at some of the services that we offer, and then we'll pivot from that back to our identity management challenge. So firstly, from a certification standpoint, within AWS, we have dozens of certifications, and we work directly with regulators to actually attain those certifications, which basically means that if you're a government entity, you do work with governments, or you're just a regulated entity who needs to be secure, through those certifications, you can rest assured that you can operate your architecture securely within AWS. But more than that, 100% of our services are also GDPR attested. So if you are maintaining business in the UK or with UK residents, you know that you can use those services within AWS and have that confidence. But more than that, there are not many organizations today that don't have some requirement for encryption in transit or encryption at rest. And basically speaking, if you have those requirements, you have to have services that support that. And we have, if you saw the keynote yesterday, over 116, in this case 117 services that support some type of encryption. That means either while you're transmitting data or that data is at rest, you can encrypt those services and encrypt the data that rides over those or stored with those services. But more than that, managing those keys around those services, managing key rotation, as well as who has access to and how you audit those keys, are really important factors when you're figuring out encryption. And that's really where our key management service comes into play. Our key management service allows for over 52 of our services to benefit from automatic key management, gaining keys that you own and you can control, as well as keys that you audit and can rotate on whatever basis that you need to. So it's a fantastic combination of using those two things to really increase the security posture of your organizations. Now, from a threat detection and application security standpoint, when we look at that, and I'm not going to go through every single service that you see on the list here, but I'll just pick a couple. We've got a lot of services that give you capabilities when you are trying to detect threats or look at securing your applications. From our AI and ML services, being Guard Duty, that looks at how you use your accounts, how you look at how you use architecture, networks, and instances on your account, and looks for patterns that really stray from your usage patterns. So it's using artificial intelligence as well as machine learning to identify those aspects and then alert you when there are those issues. And Macy is doing much the same thing on S3, looking for identifiable information, flags that you potentially want to set, and making sure to raise your security awareness when those things are found in S3 bucket. But more than that, from web application firewalls to denial of service protection, as well as the services on the bottom that allow you to log, audit, and monitor your traffic, we have a lot of services that can contribute to the overall security posture of applications that you run. So overall, what we're getting at here is you've got a ton of services. AWS has a lot of services that can help. So as we explore that, where could we actually start to leverage some of these services to tackle identity management? Well, what I wanted to explore today is where we could potentially pick a couple of those services, but also dip into other services that exist within AWS and look at how we can create a really unique solution around identity management. So if we explore the problem, let's first look at what we'd want out of an identity management suite or a package that could allow you to attack that. Number one is AI-powered. And self-service. We want a platform that allows staff, employees to really service their own identity. Get rid of the need to call a service desk, get rid of the need to remember a phone number or remember a link to actually visit, because as employees, most don't carry that number with them. Most don't remember that URL that they actually need to visit to reset their password or manage their identity. And from an AI-powered point of view, where can we bring AI into the mix of this to really allow them to have a natural language or easy flow within an application that we produce? And ultimately, as we said, we want them to be able to self-service just really the most simple things to start off with, but that may get more complicated as time goes on as well. Now, in terms of where we actually put this, most employees, as I said, aren't necessarily going to remember a phone number, but everyone these days has a smartphone, either a tablet or a smartphone in their pocket. And what that means is it's a really easy device to put a piece of software on that allows them to manage that identity, and also really extends that perimeter that allows IT to have a closer relationship with a staff member. That means that you can raise their security awareness, as we'll get into a little bit later when I actually show you some of the demo. And that's really a key aspect. So if we look at it, what could you do with a solution like this? Well, the first 2 bullet points we've really covered already. You can unlock accounts, you can reset passwords, but I just want you to imagine some other things you could do if you had a really easy piece of software directly on a mobile phone that employees could actually use. Things like group memberships. If employees potentially want to join or leave groups, potentially there's a group that gives them access to software that's going to be deployed on their PC. Or potentially they want to join a distribution group for email. They can do that directly within the application without having to call a number or navigate complex menus. Potentially, if they're managing AWS accounts, you may want to self-service IAM credentials or temporary credentials in an application like that. And that could be a really interesting way to use an application like that as well. But one of the really key things that excite me is that last one. Receive timely notifications on accounts. So ultimately what we'd also like to do is, as an end user, we want to make sure that we increase their security awareness in terms of what's happening within the organization or even what's happening inside of their own accounts or on their accounts. And through timely notifications, things like SMSs or push notifications, and you'll see what we do here, we can increase their awareness where they know if their account has been accessed from a location it shouldn't have been. If their account has been locked out, they can have that awareness. Where when they call a service desk, they may not even know that when they actually call the service desk with an issue with their account. So what else can you get? What are the core solution capabilities that we could offer in an application like this? Well, number one, it's a custom application, so it's not something that's necessarily going to be deployed in an app store. It's something you own, something open source that you can just deploy through an MDM on an as-needed basis as staff actually register for the application. I already covered the fact that it's using AI-based natural language understanding, and you'll see how we utilize that in the app. In order to do that, we're not having them navigate complex menus. It's not a complicated application. Really, they come into the application, they ask for exactly what they want, and the application knows how to service that request. Now, if you're already using AWS, you likely already have things like Direct Connect or VPN gateways. If you do, you already have that deep connectivity between your AWS accounts and your on-premises environment. So that means you already have likely the access necessary to leverage an application like this that would have access to your directories, potentially Active Directory, as well as your federation infrastructure. But one of the most important things for me, at least, is the fact that it's an open and customizable platform. And we'll look at some ideas later for what that actually means. But ultimately, what you start off with on day one, you can really expand on without having to actually redeploy the application, which is a really exciting thing. You can keep one version of the application and expand around that without having to actually do anything. So as we explore it, let's come back to our services and let's look at where our services could actually assist with solving some of these problems. Firstly, from a solution building block point of view, one of the first things we're going to need when we're actually building a mobile application is the ability to actually integrate that mobile application with AWS services. We need to surface things like authentication. We need to surface things like APIs we need to access, as well as AI interaction, as we spoke about. And that's where our Amplify framework comes into play. Our Amplify framework allows you to have a JavaScript framework. It works with iOS as well as Android. And using that single framework, you can interact with AWS services really easily. It provides user management, analytics, as well as API access, and gives you additional capabilities that we'd leverage as part of that suite. And we'll look at how fundamental Amplify is to making that solution really easy to use as well. So that's our framework to actually access services. Next thing we need is we need to think about authentication. If we're going to access our application, if we're going to authenticate that person to a corporate directory, we need to think about how that authentication is going to take place, make sure that we're supporting things like SAML. But more than that, we also want to think about how we're going to tie that device directly to that user account, making sure that that user and that device are only allowed and correlated to each other. So you can't use the same device to manage someone else's account. But at the same time, we want to support SAML as well as any other authentication algorithm that your organization supports. And that's where Cognito comes into play. Using Cognito, we can have that dual identity of allowing for SAML authentication, as well as create a device token, if you will, to authenticate the device every single time we use the application. So Cognito gives us that user directory that we're just going to be using for the device, but it gives us that pathway through federation to a corporate directory as well. It also gives us the ability to surface AWS services and authenticate to AWS services. So if we wanted to use a chatbot or we wanted to tie into other functionality, we have those credentials already to actually tie into that functionality. More than that, Cognito also gives us some other functionality on top of that. It gives us things like multi-factor authentication, adaptive authentication if it needs to step up that authentication, as well as credential protection to really detect if your credentials have been leaked elsewhere on the internet and make some recommendations around that. So that gives us authentication. Now, part of what we want to do if we build an application is we also want an analytics layer. We want to be able to determine who's using the application, how often, and we'd also like some demographics around users and that application. What version of a mobile phone are they on? Because if they're on, say, an iOS version that's low and has some security vulnerabilities, we want to be able to make a recommendation for them to actually upgrade their operating system on their iOS device. Potentially, if they're using their phone from another country that we're not expecting, or their phone is being used without their knowledge, we want to detect that activity as well. But more than that, we want to detect how they're using the application as well as how often. And that's where Pinpoint comes into play. Pinpoint gives us that ability to detect how they're using the application, where they're using it for how long, as well as what countries they are using and potentially what mobile phone and version they're using there as well. But it also gives us some other crucial functionality, which we'll get into in a little bit in terms of push notifications. Now, we spoke about AI and having a really natural language interface to this application. So we need a service that gives us that capability, something that allows us to speak naturally, ask for what we want, potentially using voice or using text, and that's where Lex comes into play. Lex, as we'll see, is surfaced directly through Amplify and gives us that capability to have a natural language flow without menus or things like that to navigate, and employees can use either their voice or type in what they're looking for. Now, if it's a password, we probably don't want to do voice. But if there are other requests that voice makes sense for, we can surface something like voice. Behind the scenes, Lex is using our Lambda service to actually execute code. Lambda, through its interaction with VPCs, already has that deep integration with the VPC, with your networks. So it's a really good pairing and mechanism to actually use the chatbot and surface that functionality through the application, as we'll see. Now, one of the things I wanted to talk about as well is a preview service that isn't released yet, but you can opt into a preview. And that's our Quantum Ledger database. When we're dealing with something as sensitive as passwords, one of the things that we want to make sure of is that we're actually able to securely audit that traffic. If someone is resetting a password, is unlocking an account, or doing really any account-related activity like joining or leaving groups, we want to make sure that we have an immutable place that we can actually store that activity. And that's what the Quantum Ledger database gives us. It gives us a centralized ledger, and through that centralized ledger, we have an append-only ledger for adding those transactions to QLDB. That means that as all of that takes place, we're committing them to QLDB, and we can then validate them. Using a cryptographic signature and a digest, we can validate that none of that information within the ledger has actually been tampered with or changed. So it gives us a fantastic mechanism to log traffic that occur, and specifically sensitive traffic that occurs through the application. And the final one that I want to explore is our secrets manager. Since we are dealing with internal directories, we're not going to be able to use things like roles to actually access those directories. We are going to have to store credentials to access, say, Active Directory or other applications. And the secrets manager gives us the ability to store those credentials and acquire those credentials when we actually need them. So that means that we don't have to hold that inside of an environment variable or directly within the function. We can just gain access to that when we actually need it. So let's look, given all of those services, let's go ahead and look at what an architecture like this would actually look like. So starting off with the really simplest bits, we've got our staff member on the left-hand side and our directory on the right. For the purpose of today's demo, I'm assuming that directory is going to be Active Directory, but it could really be anything. Since you're using Lambda at the end of the day, you can really tie into absolutely any directory you want. So tying in our first three services, we come to Amplify. So we spoke about how Amplify is that framework that gives us access to other services, and that's what we're really using here. Through Amplify, we can tap into authentication from a SAML point of view, as well as generating a device token, as well as tap into Pinpoint for analytics. So that gives us our first foundation of services that we're going to use to enable this application. After that, inside of the application, we need to surface a chatbot. And again, coming back to that, Amplify gives us an easy mechanism to actually surface that chatbot. Within a couple lines of code, we can have that chatbot running inside of a screen on our mobile application. But more than that, that Lex function is also integrating with Lambda, and Lambda is sitting inside of our VPC. So that means that we don't have to expose our directory to the internet. We don't have to open up any additional ports if your Active Directory is already sitting inside of an AWS account or accessible to an AWS account, and we can tap into that from the Lambda function. Now you'll notice on the top, that Lambda function is also integrating with those two other services. It's integrating with our Secrets Manager and KMS in terms of encrypting and managing its credential to Active Directory. It's also tapping into the Quantum Ledger database. So every time that Lambda function interacts with Active Directory and potentially changes a password or unlocks an account, that activity is being logged to that ledger, and we'll see that a bit later. So that's our application. However, one of the things that we're missing is the ability for someone to actually register and opt into the application. And that's where our top track comes into play. That top track gives us the ability to tie in, again, an API gateway and a Lambda function, things that are natively exposed through Amplify. And using that, we use a DynamoDB correlation to correlate the device directly to the user account. So we'll look at Cognito, where that device actually gets an authentication token, as well as DynamoDB, where we have that correlation between that device and that user account. So that way, that device can only be used against that user account. So that gives us most of our application. The only piece missing at this point is that awareness that we spoke about, making sure that we can actually feed information back to the staff member again. And that's where our bottom track comes into play. From the bottom, we'd have a Lambda function. That Lambda function is monitoring Active Directory for changes. So it's looking for things like passwords expiring, accounts being locked, or any other activity it may need to know about. And through the combination of a Lambda function as well as SNS from a queue perspective, it will queue notifications back to pinpoint that we potentially want that staff member to get. So we'll use that as a mechanism to actually get notifications and push notifications to the mobile device. So that's our architecture. Given that, let me hopefully show you a demo of what this actually looks like and how this functions. Let me switch over to my demo PC here. All right, great. So on the demo PC, we have a mobile application. Let me get back there again. Make sure you can see that. Yep. All right, great. So with this mobile application, this is the application that we wrote that is really surfacing this functionality. As we come into the application for the first time, we get our screen, and it hasn't been registered at this point. So right now, it's just showing us a registration screen, and this is where we'd correlate the device directly to the user account. Now, this says AWS directory right now, but as a organization that may have a SAML directory or a SAML authentication mechanism, you would use that in place of AWS. So we'll just go ahead and click that. That's now taking us through Cognito directly to Active Directory, or in this case, Active Directory Federation Services. So that's the screen that we're looking at, and we'll go ahead and we'll type in our username. So in this case, I'll go ahead and type in mine. Spelling still counts, no matter what. All right, and we'll go ahead and type in my password. Now, I have an incredibly strong password, so please don't look. There we go, and we'll sign in. Yep. Give me 1 second here. Yep, the demo gods are not playing well. All right, so it's not working right now. I'll try that in a second again. But ultimately, through this mobile application, we can then authenticate through Active Directory. And through that Active Directory authentication, we can actually get directly into our application. Let me try that one more time. No, all right, I'll show you that in a second. All right, so let me show you some of the code that actually puts this together. So first thing we start off with is Cognito. So as I mentioned, from a Cognito point of view, we want to make sure that we have our device token, and we want to make sure that we actually have an account that we're authenticated with. And here we're using our users and groups to hold both our device token as well as our user account that we're authenticating with. Near the bottom, we also have our identity providers, and that's how we're authenticating with our corporate organization. So we have a SAML provider here, and inside of the SAML provider, we have our ADFS environment. Here I've just called that AWS Cloud, but ultimately that could be any number of things in terms of your own directory. Now, in order to actually correlate and access that directory, we also need to have that DynamoDB correlation that I spoke about. So through DynamoDB, we have my account, and we have a Cognito ID, which is the device that is actually correlated to that account at the same time. So we've got my corporate account as well as the Cognito ID. So that gives us that correlation and makes sure that we can only manage that password and manage any types of activity for that account on that single device. Now, I wanted to also show you the pinpoint side of things that gives us the analytics about the application and also allows us to send push notifications. Through the pinpoint side of things and the analytics, let's delve into analytics. I can get a sense of how my application is being used. So here I can see what my active endpoints are, how many monthly endpoints. I can see a stickiness factor, as well as get general analytics on who's using the application and how they're actually using the application. More than that, I can also go to events and get a sense of what events are actually being generated on the device. Now, Cognito natively integrates with this. So from an event point of view, I can look at potentially sign-ins, authentication failures, as well as sign-ups for the device. But I can also create native events that I potentially want to track within the application. So in this case, I've added an app nav event. Every time you navigate to a different screen in the application, you can actually see that navigation. And so as we go through this, and I build out this filter, you can see that I can get a sense of how the application is being used, how many people are, say, using the chatbot, and then logging that activity. So I can use those custom events to actually flag things in the back end if I needed to flag things in the back end, or just get a sense of how my application is being used. From a demographics point of view, as I mentioned, I get a sense of the devices being used. I can see, do I have Android devices? Do I have iOS devices? More than that, I can see the version of the operating systems that are actually running on those devices as well. So I may want an alert if someone is on a known insecure version of Android or iOS. I may want to generate an alert so that we potentially communicate out to that person and make sure they actually upgrade their device. They're working on something that is actually secure. And then through Pinpoint as well, and all of this, I can also generate push notifications. So if we look at things like push notifications, for instance, let me go ahead and show you what information we actually get about this device. So if we go and query Pinpoint, sorry, I'm going to go ahead and push a notification here. Let's go ahead and push that notification to the device. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my device registration as you saw through Pinpoint. I'm going to be using the correlation that you saw through here. And with that, we can actually push notifications directly to the device. So with a simple command, and let me show you what that actually looks like, that command uses a JSON package. And that JSON package is ultimately including the endpoint. So our endpoint ID in this case that we saw within DynamoDB. And I'm sending a message. So I can send something like your account has been locked out, for instance. Press here to unlock it, and that will deep link back into the application. That it would allow you to manage the application and would allow you to unlock your account as you go through the application. And then in order to do that, I have a really simple mechanism in terms of sending a message directly to Pinpoint to tell Pinpoint to go ahead and send that push notification to a user. Now, the advantage to that is with an account, I can tell it to unlock an account. But let's say you have a building evacuation. Let's say you wanted to potentially increase their awareness in other aspects. You can use that push notification and how easy it is to send those push notifications to give them a better sense of what's happening within their organization or their building and increase their awareness there. So there's a lot of things they can build on and provide that functionality at the same time. So that would provide us with a really easy mechanism to do that. Finally, I spoke about the Quantum Ledger database. So if we look at the Quantum Ledger database, this is where we're auditing traffic and our events for our account and where we potentially want to keep track of that. So as we head into Quantum Ledger database, let's delve into that. We can look at our ledger, and we'll have a table within our ledger called audit. If we go ahead and hit run here, we get all of the activities that have occurred within the application. And these are immutable. So this is an append-only journal. So as I want to track how many passwords have been reset, how many times a person is actually doing some of these things, I've got a journal that can't actually be modified here. So if we go to page 2 here, we can see some more recent activity. And this is looking at things like password resets as well as account unlocks. So this is capturing all of that traffic that we want to capture within the application. Great. So that's ultimately what it looks like. Let me switch back to the other screen here. So given that architecture, let's look at what we just saw. I showed you the mobile application, and we'll try that a bit later as well, and just log into that. But ultimately, that mobile application is giving you the ability to register, as well as the ability to unlock those accounts and self-serve those accounts. More than that, it's using a natural language interface. So it's using a Lex chatbot in this case, and through that chatbot, you can really naturally ask for exactly what you want. So in this case, you can say, reset my password, ask for help, or potentially tell me what else I can do through the application. Now, the really interesting part of having a Lex chatbot there is the fact that we can expand on that functionality as we use the application. So that means that today, it may do things like password resets and account unlocks. But down the road, you may want to do things like, give me a meeting room, for an hour for 4 people. And that's something you can expand on as you actually use the application, and you don't have to redeploy the application to actually gain that service or that functionality. You may also want to have it, say, give you access to guest Wi-Fi access points. There's so many things you can do through that Lex chatbot without having to redeploy your application. I showed you the analytics and reporting, so we can see how we can really easily instrument our applications and get that insight into how an application is being used, and potentially identify how people are using it and where we may want to uplift some of that activity. And it gives us that insight, as well as giving us the ability to do things like push notifications. With push notifications, we can ultimately increase the security awareness of our end users and our staff, and allow them to be aware of events that are occurring on their account before those things actually happen, which is really key. And finally, as I mentioned, it's an extensible platform. That means that you can continue to develop it. It's open source, and you can actually include additional functionality in that application as you actually start using the application. Now, in terms of where you actually use the application, I've already discussed how one of the really easy use cases for it is Active Directory, which is on premises. But we also have many services inside of AWS that allow you to use that application as well. Things from workspaces from a VDI perspective, through to workdocs from a document management, as well as Connect and some of our other services. All of those services are actually underpinned by Active Directory as well. That means you could use this type of service and gain that password reset functionality directly through that password reset application, and really benefit those applications. Now, at the top of this conversation, I said that this was upwards of a $2 million problem for an organization. So what would this cost if we took all of those services that we saw in the architecture diagram and applied that to really solving this problem? Well, we take that from $2 million down to $20 a month, which is an incredible savings. So how do we actually arrive at $20 a month? Well, let's take a look at it. So from an Amplify point of view, as I mentioned, that's our JavaScript framework, and using Amplify is completely free. So you can leverage the services in that, and you don't actually pay anything for Amplify. From a Cognito point of view, it's free for the first 50,000 users. So we're easily within that for an organization of, say, 5,000 people. And for that initial SAML sign-on that we're doing, that's just $0.015 for that initial sign-on. So we easily, for 5,000 people, stay inside of that. Now, Pinpoint gives us 5,000 endpoints for free, and it's 100 million events for free, or 1 million push notifications. So easily within that limit, and it gives us a massive playground to play in where we're not really going to be spending a lot of money. Lex ultimately is our most expensive aspect of the solution. With the Lex side of the solution, we're paying about $15 for all 5,000 employees. So even then, there's not much to pay, and that's giving us our natural language integration with that service, which is fantastic. Now, I mentioned our preview service, Quantum Ledger Database. From our preview service, what we're planning from a cost perspective is only 70 cents per million writes. So that's well within that, and ultimately that means is as we write each of those transactions, we get 1 million of those for free. Now on the read side of things, we're talking about 13 cents for 1 million reads out of that service. So that's really cost effective. And finally, from a secrets management point of view, actually storing that Active Directory credential and using that credential to actually unlock the account, or at least communicate with Active Directory. That credential is about 40 cents for actually storing that credential, and is about 5 cents per 10,000 API calls. So all up, that service as a whole comes in just shy of, say, $20 a month for an organization of 5,000 people, which is a pretty cool number. And it just shows you how using those services, using that capability on top of AWS, provides you with that ability to really solve some of these challenges for a really cost-effective price. Now, if this is something that you're interested in, this is something that we're working on. We're looking at expanding and offering it on some type of open source arrangement for customers. So please take a copy of that QR code, reach out to us if this is something that you're interested in. And also, since we can't do questions, what I'll do is I'll stick around here. If you're interested in seeing the application work and get a sense of how we solve some of the problems around creating device tokens and passwords and things like that, I'm more than happy to show you some of that functionality as we wrap up here. So I appreciate your time, and I appreciate you being at Reinforce, and I hope you all have a great day. Thanks.